everyone. Thank you for coming to the special panel policies talk on what state policymakers can learn from local promise programs. My name is Brad Hirschbein. Celeste Carruthers, who's listed as the chair, is actually to my right, to your left. She's a panelist. And we decided that I would chair so that she doesn't have to do double duty. But thank you very much for coming. I'm Brad Hirschbein. I'm an economist at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, and we will be talking about promise programs. So promise programs, or place-based college scholarships, have grown tremendously in the past 10 or 15 years, depending on how you count them. There are anywhere between 100 and 300 plus of them throughout the country. They vary tremendously widely in terms of their characteristics, but one thing they do have in common is a very clear messaging around free college. Even though that may be a little bit misleading, there's still a very powerful word in free. And what we're going to talk about today is, as these programs have proliferated, researchers and policymakers both have begun to learn a fair amount about what makes these programs successful, and as they spread towards statewide promise programs, whether any of those lessons can carry onward to them as well. And so now I'm going to let the members of the panel introduce themselves, and then we'll get going.
Hi, I'm DYNARSKI. I'm an economist at the University of Michigan, and I study financial aid and education policy. Is that what they want to know about me?
Sure.
I'm 5'10".
Hello, my name is ROBYN. I am Director of Research and Policy at the College Promise Campaign. We are a national organization that advocates for free college or affordable college starting at America's community colleges.
Hi, I'm Celeste Carruthers. I'm an associate professor at the University of Tennessee in the Department of Economics there. And while I was researching the effects of a local free community college program that KRISSY, to my right, directed, the model for that program went statewide. And so I had a very kind of rare view of that, and I think a rare kind of voice in how that happened statewide. And so that's why I'm sitting here.
Hi, KRISSY DEALEJANDRO, Executive Director of tnAchieves. We are the nonprofit that serves as the partnering organization to Tennessee Promise. I'll explain that to you later, but essentially we served as the model. As Celeste said, we launched in one county in Tennessee before we went statewide, so excited to share our journey with you.
Great. To get the conversation started, I think it might be helpful to first talk about how place-based scholarships fit into the broader history of student financial aid.
I'll talk about that, Brad. So this isn't scripted at all. This is just completely spontaneous. And I'm going to give you my very idiosyncratic history of financial aid in the U.S. as it relates to free college programs. So I see free college programs as trying to counter what the increasing complexity of the expense of college financial aid in the U.S. So we have, and I've studied this, Judy Scott Clayton studied this, lots of people have examined how the complicated aid process undermines its efficacy in getting more people into college. Right? So you don't find out about, for most low-income folks, community college is already free. And in fact, many four-year universities are also essentially free because the Pell Grant covers it for them. Right? There are states where it's more expensive and the tuition is not completely covered by the Pell. But even in California, for example, pretty much low-income students get a free ride. But they don't know that until they apply, are admitted, fill out a FAFSA, and get a letter packaged that explains to them that it's free, which is, to use a technical economics term, bass-ackwards, right? Because you are finding out the price of something after you've chosen to basically buy it, right? So committing to a place by applying, filling out the essay, all that stuff, you're not going to do that unless you actually believe it's affordable in some way. So a large body of evidence at this point, I think, suggests that getting students a clear message about college being affordable can change their behavior at the point of application, which is where all the action is in the US. So I myself engaged in an experiment at the University of Michigan along with my co-authors. CJ's here. Other co-authors here? No, they're it? There's CJ. Where we pushed out to low-income high school students a message that they could get 4 years of tuition and fees free at University of Michigan if they got into University of Michigan. Now, these students all had low enough incomes that they were not only going to get free tuition and fees, but also quite a bit of their room and board covered as well. But we told them they didn't have to fill out the FAFSA. This was a strings-free commitment. If they applied and got in, they were going to get this. Now, if they filled out the FAFSA, which once we got them admitted and got them in our greedy arms, you know, our bureaucratic arms, they filled it out, right? Because they had been admitted and they had the support of the institution to get them to fill out the FAFSA. So they actually ended up getting a lot more aid. But this increased the application rate in this group of low-income, high-achieving students from about 22% to about 25% to 67%. It went from 25% to 67% in the application rate, and it went from 12% to 27% on the enrollment rate. This costs nothing, right? When you compare the aid that these treated students get, we did a randomized trial, to the control group, they're getting the same amount of aid. It's just that the control group had to go through the process of applying, then filling out the FAFSA, then being told what their aid was going to be, while the treatment group got a commitment up front. Free college is about a commitment up front, right? It's taking, depending on what the program is and how it's set up, it's taking the disparate aid programs at the state and federal level and pooling them together to basically make a message that tuition is free. And whether it's just community college or also 4 years varies from place to place. In terms of making community college free, this is a back to the future type of thing. So when community colleges were started, and in many places still, they were free. Right? So this is not a radical new idea that community college, the entry point for post-secondary education, should be free. And you can get there either by making tuition free, by subsidizing the institutions heavily, or by pulling together all these different vouchers and basically telling people that it's going to be free. And we're going to talk about capacity issues later on, yep. So I won't go into that yet. So there's my history of financial aid. There'll be a test after the presentation.
Did anyone else want to add to that?
I'll just add, in Minnesota in 1916, community college was free. So there is a history to it.
You've had community colleges in 1960?
Yes.
That's pretty good.
On the Iron Range in northern Minnesota, yes.
Much of higher education is just about remembering the past. So before I continue on, I just wanted to mention that there should have been note cards going around. If you have a question during the panel, please write it down. We'll collect them and try to answer a few at the end. There are also some more on the back table in the middle.
And this is being recorded, is being filmed and recorded, so your voices can be heard.
You have implicitly agreed to being recorded.
And you
object.
You can tweet and Snapchat and what other things?
Instagram, I don't know.
There you go.
My budding social media career has taken a leap forward. The next question, I think that, thank you, Sue, for providing a lot of that context. As a natural segue is that the policy priorities may be a little bit different. And so from a lot of local programs, in addition to trying to boost educational attainment, many of them were instituted in places that were having economic decline, and so that there might have been an economic development aspect to it as well as trying to boost education. But as they get scaled up to the state, how do those priorities compare for the local and the state policymakers?
So I think there are a lot of similarities between local promise programs and statewide promise programs. I think they all have the shared goal of increasing education attainment. They all have the shared goal of having a skilled workforce. We all hear the statistic that 90% of the jobs of the future are going to require some degree of post-secondary education. Local promise programs are really taking the lead on that initiative and innovating on local promise programs. I think there are a couple differences between state versus local. I think one of them is, as Brad had mentioned, sort of stemming decline, population decline, making sure that they have a skilled workforce, that they're able to attract business, that people want to come into a community. And Brad and his colleague, Michelle Miller-Adams, have done extensive work on this. I think there's also differences in terms of process. I think the process by which you get a statewide program is very, very different than how you would institute a local program, and I think the scale is very different at the state level. At the state level, you're going to have access to a broader tax base, possibly lottery funds, you're going to perhaps build upon what you have in local programs. I would say Governor Haslam, he was a mayor before he went statewide. There's also Governor Whitmire, very familiar with Detroit Promise and Kalamazoo Promise. So those are just a few.
Celeste or Chrissy, did you want to add?
I guess I'll say, distinct from free college has been around for a long, long time in countless different pockets and in several different waves, both in the United States and globally. And in terms of the policy priorities, one thing that makes this kind of current wave of statewide free college or free community college promise programs somewhat different is that they're kind of rooted and they're prioritizing like access and kind of equity of access, and they're tied explicitly to kind of statewide attainment goals, such as Tennessee's Drive to 55 or Oregon's 40-40-20, or kind of various other state kind of iterations on that theme where they're trying to reach a particular attainment target by a particular time and recognizing that they can get there by kind of leveraging the community college system, which has traditionally accepted some of the students, more of the students who are going to be on the fence about going to college versus not.
I'll add one thing to that. Sorry, I have the plague. So nonetheless, so what was really interesting, I've been on this journey 11 years, and when we launched the program in Knox County in one community, the first year of the program, 493 students applied. We were really intentional with school counselors to say, this is a universal acceptance program. However, what's really important to us is that we are moving the college going rate needle in your high schools. We want new students in the program. And the application number reflected those new students to the post-secondary pipeline. The first year of Promise, 6 years later, 53,896 students applied for Promise. There were bets going around Tennessee about how many would apply. I said 30,000. Someone said 25. That we were all grossly mistaken. But what has evolved is that because Tennessee Promise had the bully pulpit of the governor's office, and because it had a marketability that we did not have when we were local, became a solid plan B. So it was that plan A for students who had no plan A, but it was also a plan B for many of our students. And oftentimes what I've found now working with students for the last 11 years is that plan B many times becomes plan A, and if they don't have that solid plan B, they have no plan at all. And Promise has really provided that foundation across Tennessee, and so very different in a local and statewide in terms of scale of student, yes, but also scale of mindset and the idea that you really are working to shift the culture within the state.
Thank you both. So as the programs get scaled up, a natural question is, what are some of the design principles that are associated with the most effective programs? Yes, in access, but also in the bigger issue, perhaps as we go forward, getting people through the door at the far end. Who would like to take the first on that one?
I think I would like to take the first on that one. Okay, so I'll say first of all that it's hard to answer this question because there aren't a lot of multi-site studies out there that can kind of connect the dots across different local promise programs and tell us which design features have worked and replicated in multiple different contexts. Now, even today at this meeting, I've had sidebar conversations with people who are working on those very studies, and I kind of eagerly anticipate learning what they find. But in the meantime, I think that we can just highlight some features of programs, both place-based, but also prior financial aid programs, merit or income-based, and the lessons that we've learned therein. And I'll just highlight two because I'm sure others have thoughts on this. And one that we saw with Knox Achieves and then tnAchieves and then Tennessee Promise was kind of the power of this very clear, very transparent message about the price of college and the timing within which that message was delivered to students when they became aware of like what the tuition cost of college would be for them. And Sue has already touched on this point. And the second feature across different successful programs and earlier iterations of student aid interventions that has been effective has been advising or coaching or mentoring or whatever you wish to call it. KRISSY Dealejandro, and Tennessee Promise mentors feature very prominently in each 3 of those programs as it scaled up. In a variety of other contexts and experimental analyses, folks have shown that many sitting in this room, that advising students as they're preparing for college or as they're going to college is really effective and can move the needle. And then once they get to community college, having an advising capacity there is shown to be very important. So college is a maze. It is really complicated to complete your graduation checklist, much less navigate a transfer pathway to a 4-year university if that's where you ultimately want to go. And to anyone who's saying, well, then you shouldn't be in college, then just know that it's also hard for advisors to navigate all of these things when they have caseloads of several hundred students or more. And we've seen in the CUNY in Ohio accelerated study in associate programs, which many of you are probably familiar with, that these wraparound support structures that include advising at a cost that almost meets the cost of financial aid in those programs to be a very effective component of student success. And we see versions of that in local and statewide promise programs as well.
Thanks. Robyn or Sue, did you want to add to that?
I'll just build off of what Celeste said. We are doing a deep dive into college promise programs, into what we call our database. And part of that work is we're trying to look at what supports are offered to students. And we have some preliminary analysis, and the key feature that we find most commonly listed are it's academic advising and career services. Mary Ronner out of West Ed did something similar with college promise programs in California. She found similar results in addition to Summer Bridge. We're also doing some work with MDRC, and they have 6 sites that they're working with across the country looking at student support services, and they're going to be releasing a policy brief at the end of April showing some of their initial results. But it's about communication, student communication, and career advising.
So the promise of promise programs is to simplify the process for students and to send a clear message. It's entirely possible to create a free college program that is just as complicated, dense, and bureaucratic as what it's intended to replace. So I would say that anybody who's designing a new program should do their best to get involved with the program, people who are first gen, whose parents didn't go to college, and who have experienced trying to get into and through college without having parents who've gone to college, because I think such people have an invaluable lens on what the barriers can be. So I think that many of the people who design financial aid policies, who run financial aid programs, who run the United States government, haven't had such an experience and don't know when they've created barriers. And we can, being attentive up front when we're designing the programs can mean that they're more effective from the get-go.
Thanks. And I wanted to add that one of the other things that we've learned from the research is that when you have a promise program, particularly generous local-based ones, whether they be for 4-year or 2 years, is that because of the power of free, it changes who goes to college. There's selection effects. And those selection effects bring a different composition of students into the colleges, and that they bring their own set of challenges with them. And the colleges don't always get the resources to provide the services that those new students need. And so the funding challenge isn't just for the students, it's also in many cases for the colleges themselves. To the extent that the Promise programs are well funded, many of them are trying to transition from the initial, let's just give money, and some of the earliest Promise programs were basically money with very few strings attached. And then they started looking at the results, and yes, most of them have been effective in increasing enrollment, and some of the earliest ones have been effective in increasing completion rates. but the numbers are still very, very far away from 100%, which should not be surprising. And the Promise programs, as they've matured, have started considering changing some of the parameters of the programs and adding some of the services that the panelists have been talking about, as it becomes very clear that just providing money isn't going to be enough, because it is a maze, and additional services are supported, and someone needs to pay for those services. And in some cases, the state governments are paying for them, like Tennessee, but in other cases, in a lot of the programs that have been implemented, whether they be local or state, those aren't coming yet. And so that's going to be a recurring challenge also. But in terms of going forward, specifically since Tennessee is one of the early leaders in the statewide program, what are some of the lessons that were learned as Tennessee was ramped up? Because those are probably going to be very applicable as other states ramp up some of either their own local programs. California is underway. As Robyn mentioned, there's a proposal in Michigan to learn from a lot of the local programs. So what can we learn from Tennessee?
You want to start? Okay, so you go.
Okay. So, first of all, having an external researcher was incredibly important as we began to scale. Celeste got on board year 2 of InexorablyAchieves, so very early on in the process. I had businessmen as funders, and they wanted to know, am I moving the needle? This was as much about the needle as it was about doing something that we felt really good about, right? Helping students earn some type of post-secondary credential. So bringing Celeste on board from the beginning was intentional on our part, because we wanted to say there's an external researcher really digging into the economic viability of this program. Are we building a future workforce? I have a CEO of a Berkshire Hathaway company on my board, and every time we have a board meeting, he says, are our students earning more money than non-Tennessee Promise students? It is a question that I'm consistently asked, and that's his quantifiable measure as a business person who continues to donate to the nonprofit that's operating all the non-financial components of the Tennessee Promise. I'll say this, a couple of things that we've learned. Number one, I'm going to use a really technical term, but smooshing really does matter. And what I mean by that is that there's no silver bullet with these programs. Free opens the door. Mentors provide encouragement. Consistent communication helps the first generation parent. Summer bridge programs ensure that students who require remediation feel more confident about themselves as a college student. We have a coaching model now for our lowest income student, this proactive, every month person who's reaching out to the student to say, where are you today in terms of life? It isn't necessarily academically based, so that the students have a trusted individual that when they hit that inevitable roadblock, they know who to turn to. So what I've really learned, to be honest with you, is that the smooshing matters. It's layering of non-financial services that has really gotten us to where we are in Tennessee. I will tell you this, it's hot off the press, but from our internal research, what we're showing now is that our 3-year grad rate for Promise students is 3.5 times greater than their non-Tennessee Promise peers. 3.5 times greater grad rate. To your point, we're still not where we want to be, but it's incredible to watch the fact that these students are almost, Celeste has taught me this word, statistical twins in terms of academic preparedness and the way that what the households that they're coming from, but they're excelling far beyond. And I think it really is about what I refer to as sort of this smooshing effect.
I'll add some, just a perception I had as a researcher, kind of an outsider to this process as it scaled up to be a statewide policy. What I found really remarkable was all of the work and effort and sweat equity and thought that went into implementing this program statewide in such a way that students in any one county had a very similar experience as students in another county, regardless of whether tnAchieves had been there before, but also that the model was scaled and really reflected the local program that it was founded in. I was just kind of impressed with the amount of work that went into implementation, and that some of that kind of bore out in the data. I mean, we found approximately like a 10% increase in college coming out of Knox-Achieves. And then when we moved to statewide Tennessee Promise, you can see this for yourselves in IPED's data now, there was, ballpark of a 10% increase in first-time freshmen in across the college, 2- and 4-year college system overall, but with most of that going to 2-year schools and some decline in 4-year schools. So a lot of what we had saw analytically coming out of the Knox-Achieves program was mirrored in what happened when it became statewide Tennessee Promise.
And as the programs ramp up and reach the state level, and the scale is clearly much greater, and one issue is the financial sustainability of being able to commit money to doing so. State budgets are notoriously fickle, they're relatively short term. The next budgetary cutback, are they going to survive, and how does that actually affect students' decisions, and what's going through state policymakers' minds when they actually are trying to set up these programs or scale them up. And Robyn, did you want to add a little bit about the sustainability?
Yeah, so at the College Promise campaign, we take financial sustainability really seriously. Governor Haslam, when he launched the Tennessee Promise, he said, a promise is not a promise unless it's financially sustainable, and he made that happen. So in Tennessee, that there's a irrevocable trust that will fund the Tennessee Promise. And we've seen data from SUE, from Tennessee Promise, from Rhode Island. When you have free, you know that you're gonna get an increase in students. So. And we've also seen sort of the drawbacks of that. We've seen Free City in San Francisco. Oregon had some issues with regard to not being able to fully fund. So we have undertaken a financial sustainability survey. We sent it out to over 200 Promise programs, both local and statewide, throughout the nation. And we're in the process of doing some initial analysis on financial sustainability. We asked all sorts of questions about what's the average promise, how many students do you serve, what are your support services, what's the overhead, and we will be releasing the results of that, I believe, in sometime this summer.
Thanks. So as we are learning from this, policymakers are clearly very busy people. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they actually do want to achieve the outcomes that we've been talking about. There are clearly competing incentives for many of them. But because they are busy people and there's a lot going on, how do these lessons best percolate up to them in a way that they're going to understand and that is going to be compatible with the other things that they're facing? Sue, do you want to start with that one, or effectively reaching policymakers, what seems to be effective?
Sure. A good
Yeah.
Twitter. A good Twitter?
A good Twitter.
Pet pictures, I find critical for getting people's attention. If you are a researcher and want to get information, and when I say researcher, you might be in a policy shop or you might be an academic, but if you want to get information into the hands of policymakers, a working paper series is certainly not going to do the trick. And for that matter, you can try to place op-eds. This is what communications officers at all universities seem to be trained to do, but that's a pretty low success rate as well. If you can do it, great, but you can't count on that as your dissemination approach. Policy briefs of some sort that you throw up on a website that are easily accessible to people. Active Twitter where you push those results. It's true. I mean, the people who make these policies tend to have staff, at least, who are on Twitter, and sometimes they themselves are on Twitter. So tweeting out results, talking to the press about them, simplifying them as much as possible. I mean, so just as it's important to send a simple message to the students about affordability, policymakers are very, very busy people. And they have no obligation to read anything you write or listen to anything you say. So you have to put it into as crisp and clear and concise a format as you possibly can. Nobody has an obligation to read anything that you write, and so doing it well, doing it crisply is what you need to do if you want to get yourself heard.
Just to echo some of what she said, I spent a lot of time up on Capitol Hill working for very senior members of the US Senate, and you have to really condense what you're saying to make it accessible. I think relationships matter. I I'm sure both you and DYNARSKI, I have talked to the governor's office about their proposal coming out of the governor's proposal. But if there's a way that the College Promise campaign can facilitate some of these connections, please reach out. We like to do some outreach and engagement at all levels of government, from local, state, and federal, but also to practitioners and researchers. We have a College Promise Research Network, which right now is about 8 scholars that have engaged in Promise research. We want to expand that later this year. We have a bibliography, about 20-page bibliography on various aspects of College Promise literature. So if there's opportunities for us to make connections, we would love that. We are now beginning policy briefs. I did the first one in collaboration with Tennessee Higher Education Commission. We have one that was just released today, a summary of Dr. Doug Harris's Milwaukee degree project, which he presented at Brookings last September. And then Jennifer Riddy and Lindsay Page are going to do a policy brief later this month on the Pittsburgh Promise. So if you are interested in collaborating with us on policy briefs, please reach out.
Thanks. Celeste, Chrissy, have you learned anything in terms of Tennessee, of the interaction between the researchers and the policymakers and the support organizations, and how that actually, you mentioned, Chrissy, about how the business community needs to get involved too. How does that very complicated relationship, can we distill something out of that would be helpful?
Yeah, sure. I would just say messaging matters. Know your audience when you are presenting your research. When I talk about Tennessee Promise to presidents of chambers, I only talk about workforce development. When I talk to school counselors, I talk about their students going on to post-secondary. When I talk to post-secondary, I talk about completion rates. So know your audience, I think, and making sure, to your point, that it's brief, but also really pointed to the audience that you're trying to reach, because they have their interests in mind, and if you're not touching that interest, it will likely be the noise that is coming to them in waves. I would also say this, as important as the research and the data are, I love data. I'm called like the crazy data lady in Tennessee. I'm very happy with that title, just for the record. But I would also say that student voice matters. So finding a student who's benefited from the program that you are talking about, or programs, and ensuring that that is woven into the research really does touch the policymaker in a different way, as opposed to strict data analysis.
I got involved in this particular research because I was in the right place at the right time, and I think I have some lessons from the right place part to share. There's not much you can do about the right time part. I have a joint appointment with the Department of Economics and then a research center. And the research center has for several decades done a lot of work in collaboration or for various different state agencies, forecasting unemployment, or forecasting the balance of unemployment insurance reserves, or kind of a tax revenue analysis, or just kind of expanding the analytic capacity of the state government. And so that deep history of relationships, which have to be rebuilt every time there's a change in administration or a new commissioner, which happens often. It's not exclusive to research centers that have been around for several decades, because we have to rebuild this quite often. But having relationships with folks really helps us have a voice at the table, helps us get our research to people who can actually use it, and gives us some credibility, and gives us a deep history in the state of delivering bad news sometimes to folks who are kind of disappointed in what the results say. And so, for instance, when I heard Randy Boyd, who was involved in INEXorably and tnAchieves early on, kind of speak about the program several years ago, and said, I would like to evaluate that, and I think we can with the data that we have on hand. I've warned him, I might find that you guys wasted all of your money. And said, okay, so we had decades of trust kind of behind us, and credibility to go along with that.
Thanks. And that's a very real issue, is that we still don't understand quite a lot about these programs and who they're, which groups they're affecting. Some students might benefit more than others. Even the earliest programs, we still don't know. It was mentioned about what's going to be the ROI essentially. You know, how much are these students going to be earning? Are they earning more than if these programs didn't exist? We don't have answers to those questions yet. It turns out it's actually, not only is it hard to get the data to look at those, but you need to wait quite a few years for the program to be around for people to finish their education, get into the workforce, and have enough data to be able to say something. And we're actually just beginning to look at that question now to be able to answer some of the workforce outcomes. We're hoping that we'll be able to have some information later this year on that outcome. But there are definitely concerns about the equity and efficiency of many of these programs because they do vary a lot. And there's something about a power free of having a universal program. But there's been a long trade-off between having a targeted program where you think that the money can be effectively used, but perhaps only reach a relatively narrow segment of students, or open it up and make it easy with fewer strings attached. That cuts down the administrative costs, it amplifies the message of free, but that means that the people receiving the money may not be the same groups of people as money receiving under a more targeted program. So what do we think about that in terms of equity, efficiency, and where the money's going? Okay, I want to start. Sure.
You know, so by their nature, community colleges tend to overwhelmingly enroll low-income, first-generation, non-traditional students. So simply by focusing the free college efforts on community colleges, we're going to tend to target that population. Some middle-class people might sneak in. And the question always is with a universal versus a targeted program is the trade-off of complexity with a broader eligibility, and you have to be willing to take that trade-off. And if you get, you know, another 10 low-income students in for every one middle-income student who manages to get free college, then that's a welfare calculation that you can make about whether you think that's worth it. I would think that's worth it, but that's what you need to think about. So, you know, universal programs in the U.S. If you think of Social Security, right, that is a universal program. Everybody gets it, no matter how high their income. The benefits, you can have targeting within a universal program. The benefits are actually higher for low-income people because they get more based on what they give in than do higher income people, but everyone gets it. And that means that it's the third rail of American politics. You can't touch Social Security. And it'd be great if we could get free college basically the same place, that it can't be touched. Anything that's targeted just at low-income students tends to be vulnerable politically, because low-income students and their families are not the most powerful of constituencies. So I think the politics of it are quite, we haven't talked about that here, but I think the politics of it is something that makes it very attractive.
Just to add on about the return on investment, at the federal level, we rely on IPEDS data and NIPSAS data. And if you want to compare promise students to their non-promise peers, there's not a lot of data out there that can help us make those comparisons. So we are really relying on the local and the statewide programs and you as researchers to help us make some of those decisions.
I will say this, that when we were building the model for Achieves that became Tennessee Promise, it was really important to me that we had a universal acceptance model. I grew up, my mom didn't make it past her sophomore year of high school, and my dad barely graduated from high school. And so I think my personal experience of growing up in rural Tennessee, a poor first-generation kid, I never wanted that stigma attached to our program. Oh, this program's a program for poor kids. I wanted every kid that came to our program to feel really good about the decision that they were making. And so we launched with both feet in specifically for that reason. And I will tell you now, having worked with 320,000 students over the last decade, it is a very different conversation. So I'm gonna hug you after this panel. I don't know if you're a hugger, but you're getting hugged, because what I think is so important is when you walk into a room of students and you say, college is free, and then you provide them all the support they need to navigate that very complex, monstrosity that is higher ed. It's very different from saying, if you complete the FAFSA, which is built to keep students from going to college, then maybe you will then qualify for a then you could go to college for free, right? I mean, it's just a very different conversation. And as a practitioner and as a person that still stands in front of thousands of students every year, that is really powerful. And if you want this to be about moving the needle and making a dent in the universe, I think you sort of miss it. Another thing that I think is really important to note about Tennessee Promise, because there has been criticisms about the lowest income student not receiving funding, well, you're missing it, right? Because what we do is we raise private dollars, so there's a foundational support for every student, but the student who is the first to leave is the student who gets all the layers of support that we are wrapping our arms around those students when they decide they want to be a part of Tennessee Promise.
Thanks. We have another one or two questions that we've already written down, but if you have questions that you have written down, please start passing them to this side of the room. Mark is going to collect them, and then we'll start answering a few of those at the end too. So please pass them down if you've written questions.
I'm glad we're putting the program officer from Smith District to work. He needs to be useful.
Thank you, Mark.
Can I toss something? I don't know where the capacity stuff is going to be.
Yeah, I was gonna get to that.
Okay, all right.
So part of it is going to be capacity, and I wanted to ask one question before we get to that one, and that's due to the specific supports that were mentioned. As we try ramping those up, it turns out that there's extensive research, much of which has been done by people in this room, or people who know people in this room, about the effect of money. It's relatively easy to design a research study that shows how effective additional scholarship money is in even enrolling people. It's harder to do it for graduating, whether people graduate, but we've actually gotten some research there. But the additional supports, that's hard because they're very, very fuzzy. It's relatively straightforward to say, okay, here's what an additional $5,000 does. People can kind of understand that. But when it comes to the additional college coaching, mentoring, whether there's a monitoring system that's doing first alerts, there are so many different varieties there that how do we know what's going to be effective for different types of students? That seems to be where a lot of the money needs to go. We know from ASAP, as Celeste mentioned, that specific package was very effective in New York, and it was also very effective when it was reconstituted in Ohio, but we don't know that that's going to work everywhere, and it was very, very expensive. So in terms of where you want to spend the marginal dollar to actually get to that degree completion, which is apparently a lot of state policymakers' goals, what do we think about where the next lines of research is in trying to figure out how should we spend that money?
So in K-12, you know, public school is free. That's just sort of understood, right? So that's not, the cost of K-12 is not even part of the conversation. So what do we focus on in the policy conversation is how to make education better, right? We don't say, hey, it's free, so kindergartners, go forge forward and get yourself an education and pull yourself up by your bootstraps till you get to high school. You know, instead we focus on what's the best curriculum, how do we train teachers, what's an optimal class size, so all the elements of how we design education to make it work well. And that's a conversation where I would say that is only just starting in post-secondary. And I think that's where research needs to go, is how do we make post-secondary education work well? And this is not, and this has been a matter of, you know, physician heal thyself, right? So professors in particular are very fond of having anybody come in and tell them how to teach. So, you know, what curriculum works well, what teaching styles work well, all that stuff. Think of anything we know in K-12, any fact we know about what works in K-12, and we pretty much know nothing about it in post-sec. So there's a huge number of research questions to approach, and they're critical ones because, you know, what free college does is it pushes on the demand side. It makes college cheaper, and it's going to increase demand for schooling. If we don't respond with a greater supply of slots for students and make college accessible to students, then we're going to get crap results. This was something that played out actually in the development literature, economic development, where there was for many years an effort to give incentives to families to get their children to school. So the Progressive program in Mexico, a few other ones, basically would pay the families that the kids went to school. And then 5 or 10 years later, there was sort of noticing these kids weren't actually getting more education. They weren't advancing to higher levels of education. And then the next set of research was, hey, there's no teacher in that school. You know, the teachers are absent and they're not actually there, or there's not a school, like there's not a building, right? So, you know, wow, we actually need to do something on the capacity side. And that's how I think about post-secondary as well, is that we need to be funding our institutions if we want to be getting people through college. You can get them to show up, but if you want to graduate, then you actually have to work on providing a good education. And there is pretty strong evidence that when you just fund scholarships, but don't fund institutions, you don't get increases in degree completion. And I'm thinking here of Deming and Walter's paper on this question. And there's more, but basically we need to get beyond the question of how much and focus on the question of how we deliver education.
I think one area that would be very interesting to dig into would be California, because they have generous state financial aid. They had a lot of local promise programs, and then they came in with the College Promise money, what's referred to as AB 19, and that gave institutions an amount of funding that they could essentially figure out what they wanted to do with it. They could put it to books, they could put it to support services, and I just think once we are a few years out, that would be a fascinating study of what these institutions did with